Semana 13 article presentation. The article that I chose was entitled Lessons on Effective Teaching from Middle School ESL Students, and it was written by Ellen M. Curtin, Assistant Professor of Early Childhood Education at Texas Wesleyan University in Fort Worth, Texas. In her introduction, our researcher tells us about the 6 students that she interviewed over 6 months. Each of these students were Mexican students in middle school and had attended ESL courses. She names each student and gives a little bit of personal information about each one. What she focuses mainly on in her introduction is talking about how culturally diverse, linguistically diverse that these 7th and 8th grade students are. She then focuses on prior research, stating that ESL students, English as a second language students, have increased over 95% in the last few years. Though, despite the increase, there has been a lack of teacher training for ESL students. Many of the teachers say that it is based on the state mandated tests, and the expectation to deliver on these tests has precluded them from focusing on their ESL students. But if teachers knew how better to improve their instruction, they would do so. The purpose and the research question. This was an ethnographic study into these students, and the purpose of this research was to determine effective teaching strategies for ESL students in the middle school grades at 7th and 8th grade. The sample, although small, were 6 Mexican middle school students enrolled in an ESL program in Texas. All of the students had graduated out of the ESL program. It was their 3rd year in the United States, and they had each had 2 full years of ESL classroom training, and now they were mainstreamed into the regular school day. And they were mainstreamed into courses where their teachers were not ESL trained. Of course, the limitation one was very obvious. It was only 1 school in the United States in Texas, and only 6 students were interviewed. But it was a 6-month study, which was fantastic. So methods and data. It was a 6 months long study, and it was based on interviews. It was verbal responses given by the students and also classroom observation. A tool was also used, the Banks Multicultural Teaching Behaviors Model, to be able to make observations, evaluations based on the observations of the classrooms. Just as for information, Banks Multicultural Teaching Behavior Model talks about 2 approaches to teaching, the interactive model and the didactic model. The interactive model is a more personalized, that includes cooperative grouping, child-centered, focus on process of teaching, intuition, empathy, nonverbal communication, classroom wittiness, meaning that there's humor in the classroom. Students and teachers are active and learning together, and there's a democratic discipline style, as opposed to a didactic model, which is impersonalized, individualistic, subject-centered rather than student-centered, focused on the curriculum or teaching to the test, pragmatic, non-empathic, and less likely to pick up on nonverbal cues, and student-teacher interaction is more passive. The discipline style is autocratic. This researcher observed and interviewed students based on these 7 criteria. How students perceived their personalized classroom, cooperative grouping, student-centered planning for individual learning styles, process of the teaching, intuitive and nonverbal communication, students and teachers learning together, and classroom discipline style. Of course, these are the principles based on the model previously referred to, the Banks model. So in the personalized classrooms, students overwhelmingly performed better in classrooms where their teachers knew their names, greeted them at the door, and especially where they incorporated culture into the lesson. The result of this was that students felt more relaxed. They were able to offer their opinions They increased in their own personal pride for their countries of origin, and they were also able to express and recognize the efforts that the teachers were making to make a connection with them. This connection with the teachers was very empowering to the students. Cooperative grouping. In the didactic classroom, the expectation is that students work individually and that the seats are in rows and nobody asks each other questions. That did not seem to work very well with the students. What they really enjoyed were where they could ask their partners, classroom classmates questions in their native tongue, be able to get greater understanding from their classmates. Many of them were afraid of making their teachers mad by asking too many questions. And I found it so interesting that they would take turns to ask questions so that not any one student would get the brunt of the anger from the teacher who wasn't willing to answer these questions. By making the classroom cooperative, students gained greater understanding. They got better explanations because they could get a different point of view from peers. It reduced their fear and increased their learning dramatically. Student-centered planning for individual learning styles. It was concluded that ESL students, or students that come from anywhere around the world to the United States, are actually more globally minded, as it was stated here, where they need a right-brained approach to learning. They need to spend more time with explanations. They need to do hands-on things. They need to see a finished product. They need to ask follow-up questions. Things that worked for these students were multiple examples. In the research, in the research questions, the word example came up 57 times. The students required multiple examples, and when the teachers were not willing to give those examples, that definitely decreased student engagement and motivation. They needed to see a finished product. They needed their teachers to walk around the classroom so that they could have an opportunity to speak to them and ask questions. And they needed a step-by-step approach. By using these styles, more students' needs were met and their motivation was increased and their fear response was decreased. It was really important for them to see an end product of what they needed to do. It helped them to visualize what the expectation was. So the process of teaching. Of course, there are many teaching styles, but what was emphasized was the flexibility of trying a variety of things and teachers being willing to change. It appeared that by using the learning strategies that are used more in elementary education into the middle school years for ESL students, the students are better able to grasp concepts. This includes tactile and kinesthetic work because they just need greater support. It looks like the evidence does support for right-brained students and group learning. Especially Hispanic students are more verbal and prefer a more group learning approach. The effect was greater student-centered learning. Teachers became adaptive and reflexive, meaning they were able to make those changes necessary for their student success. Intuitive and nonverbal communication. Teachers who were focused more on the feelings of their students, more on the interactive model, would walk around the classroom, focus on students' facial expressions and their nonverbal expressions and approach them, giving them opportunities for hands-on practice and continuous asking questions. They also made sure that every student in the classroom participated, not just those who knew the right answer. And the effect of this was that students respected their teachers. They could tell which teachers were lazy teachers, as they would call them, those who wouldn't put in the effort to walk around the classroom and make sure everybody's voice was heard. There was increased student participation and the students felt cared for. This idea that students, ESL students, are shy gets erased. It's not always that they're shy. It's simply that they don't have an opportunity, they're fearful. Students and teachers actively learning together. This slide's a little bit different. What I put on the left, the reaction is on the right. So silent classroom, the effect was fear response. The students were very uncomfortable in a classroom that required complete silence. Where students did the talking, they had greater learning when they could work cooperatively and especially ask questions of their peers in their native language. And group work, again, gave them time to have extra practice to ask questions compared to their peers and to ask for help. Was the type of discipline. So a democratic classroom was one that had humor. Wasn't if a mistake was made, if a rule was broken, it wasn't always come down with an immediate consequence. It could be brushed off with a little bit of humor, wittiness, as was stated. It's also an interactive classroom, meaning that if a rule was broken, a student and a teacher could talk about it. Yes, rules are set up so that will cover the majority, but exceptions do need to be made, and that needs to be an option. A family type atmosphere and an inquiry response style atmosphere. In these types of classrooms, there's time given to the student to correct behavior, time to express themselves, as opposed to an autocratic classroom where there's no humor, no interaction, and no exceptions. All of these things create fear, and as we know, fear is an obstacle to learning. So in the conclusion of this research, of course, we had 6 ESL students from one middle school, all of them Mexican students. It was based on interviews with the students on those 7 criteria and observation. The picture that emerged was one in which ESL students perceived that interactive instructional models were more congruent with their learning needs than didactic ones. This picture reflects the educational research and literature which showed that many ESL and culturally diverse students prefer styles of inquiry and response different from the standard procedures used in many classrooms. Overall, this research I think was a little bit on the older side because I feel that in terms of the educational models these days, we are very much reaching more towards an empathic classrooms, social emotional learning, and these need to track across the board to ESL students also, no matter how many years they've been in the country. They need those opportunities to have pride in their language, speak their language, not hide from their culture, be able to engage freely and not feel shame for learning to understand concepts in the classroom. Thank you.